In the sleepy village of St. Mary's Bell, a single church bell tolled at 4 p.m. a sound that should have meant nothing, but signaled death. Pause. When solicitor Reginald Poole is found murdered in the churchyard, clutching a cryptic note that reads Phantom Bell, the quiet manner of Lady Beatrice Ashford becomes a cauldron of secrets. Who rang the bell? Why was Poole's left-handed grip on the note in his right hand? And what dark truth drove a killer to strike? Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a mind sharper than a blade, unraveling a web of blackmail, hidden pasts, and desperate loyalty. Suspenseful music swells. Over 15 chapters. Follow her as she pieces together clues: a smear of mud, a torn shawl, a letter with wet ink to reveal a shocking truth that will change Bell Manor forever. Can you spot the killer before Miss Marple does? Music crescendos and fades. Chapter 1. The Quiet of St. Mary's Bell. In the late summer of 1935, the village of St. Mary's Bell lay draped in the soft haze of an English afternoon, its cobbled lanes and ivy-clad cottages exuding a deceptive tranquility. The village, nestled in the heart of Devon, was known for its ancient church, St. Mary's, whose single bell tolled only for services, weddings, and funerals. Yet, as Dr. Arthur Heywood, the village's amiable physician, strolled past the churchyard that Tuesday at precisely 3:15 p.m., he could not shake the peculiar feeling that the air held a whisper of unease. Dr. Heywood, a man of 40 with a penchant for observing the subtleties of human nature, served as the unofficial chronicler of St. Mary's Bell. His practice brought him into the homes of the village's residents, from the grand estate of Bell Manor to the modest dwellings of the shopkeepers. It was a role that suited his quiet curiosity, though he often felt like a mere spectator to the village's dramas. Today, his thoughts were occupied by the gathering at Bell Manor, where Lady Beatrice Ashford was hosting a weekend party to celebrate the engagement of her nephew, Mr. Julian Ashford, to Miss Clara Wentworth, a young woman of striking beauty and uncertain origins. Bell Manor stood at the edge of the village, its gray stone walls softened by climbing roses and its windows glinting in the afternoon sun. The Ashford family had owned the estate for generations, and Lady Beatrice, a formidable widow of 60, presided over it with an iron will cloaked in impeccable manners. The guest list for the weekend was a carefully curated affair: Julian, the charming but reckless heir, Clara, his enigmatic fiancé, Mr. Reginald Poole, a solicitor with a sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, a widowed cousin with a penchant for gossip, Captain Lionel Drake, a retired naval officer, an old friend of the family, and Miss Lydia Prescott, a spinster of indeterminate age who served as Lady Beatrice's companion. Rounding out the party was young Tommy Ashford, Julian's teenage cousin, whose schoolboy exuberance often grated on the adult's nerves. Dr. Heywood had been invited to dine at the manor that evening, a courtesy extended due to his long-standing friendship with Lady Beatrice. As he approached the manor's wrought iron gates, he noted the time on his pocket watch, 3:30 p.m. The village was unusually quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He paused, his attention drawn to the church tower across the meadow. The bell, silent for days, seemed to loom larger in his mind than it ought. He dismissed the thought as fanciful and continued up the gravel drive. Inside Bell Manor, the atmosphere was one of polished civility, though Dr. Heywood sensed an undercurrent of tension as he was ushered into the drawing room by the butler, Mr. Grimes. Lady Beatrice sat near the fireplace, her silver hair immaculate, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. Julian and Clara stood by the window, their heads bent in quiet conversation, though Clara's posture suggested unease. Reginald Poole was examining a leather-bound book from the manor's library, his fingers tapping impatiently. Mrs. Carver, perched on a velvet settee, was recounting a scandal from London society to Captain Drake, who nodded politely but seemed distracted. Miss Prescott, ever unobtrusive, was arranging flowers in a vase, her movements deliberate and silent. Tommy, sprawled on a rug with a model aeroplane, was the only one who seemed oblivious to the room's strained atmosphere. Dr. Heywood. "How good of you to join us," Lady Beatrice said, her voice warm but measured. "We are all quite looking forward to this evening's festivities, though I fear the young people may find our little village dull." "Not at all, Aunt Beatrice," Julian replied, flashing a disarming smile. "Clara and I are delighted to be here, aren't we, darling?" Clara nodded, her smile fleeting. "It's a charming place," she said softly, her voice carrying a faint trace of an accent Dr. Heywood couldn't place. He made a mental note of it, as he often did with such details, though he could not say why it struck him as significant. The conversation turned to the engagement, with Mrs. Carver probing Clara about her family, a subject the young woman deftly deflected. Captain Drake, meanwhile, seemed preoccupied, his gaze drifting to the window as if expecting to see something beyond the manicured lawns. Dr. Heywood observed these interactions with his usual quiet attentiveness, noting the way Poole's eyes lingered on Clara, the way Miss Prescott's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the flowers, and the way Tommy's chatter filled the silences that fell too often dot out precisely for p.m. As the group moved toward the terrace for tea, a sound shattered the calm. It was the bell of St. Mary's, tolling once, then twice, then falling silent. The sound was deep and resonant, carrying an inexplicable weight. Dr. Heywood froze, as did the others. Lady Beatrice's teacup rattled in its saucer. Julian's smile faltered. Clara's hand flew to her throat. "That's odd," Captain Drake said, his voice low. "The bell hasn't rung outside of services in years." "Perhaps it's a mistake," Miss Prescott offered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sexton may have been testing it." "No," Tommy said, his eyes wide with excitement. "Old Mr. Gibbs never rings it without reason. He says it's bad luck to ring it for nothing." "Nonsense," Lady Beatrice said sharply, though her face had paled. "It's merely a bell. Let us not be superstitious." But Dr. Heywood, watching the group, noted the unease that lingered in their eyes. The bell's toll seemed to hang in the air, a phantom note that refused to fade. He glanced at his watch again. 4:02 p.m. The time, like the bell, felt significant. Though he could not yet say why. As the group resumed their tea, the conversation turned strained, each guest retreating into their own thoughts. Dr. Heywood, ever the observer, felt a prickle of foreboding. He could not shake the sense that the bell's toll had marked the beginning of something or the end. Chapter 2. The shadow of the bell. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the terrace of Bell Manor, where the guests had settled with their tea, though the earlier tolling of St. Mary's bell lingered in their minds like an unwelcome guest. Dr. Arthur Heywood, seated at a wicker table with a view of the manicured lawns, sipped his tea and observed the group with his characteristic quiet attentiveness. The air was warm, fragrant with roses, but the mood was anything but serene. The bell's unexplained toll at 4 p.m. had unsettled everyone, though they masked it with varying degrees of success. Lady Beatrice Ashford, ever the composed hostess, directed the conversation toward the upcoming engagement party, her voice steady but her eyes darting to the church tower visible across the meadow. "We shall have a splendid evening tomorrow," she declared, adjusting the lace at her cuff. "The village band has promised a selection of waltzes, and I've ensured the dining room is prepared for 30 guests." 30? Mrs. Evelyn, Carver exclaimed, her teacup pausing halfway to her lips. My dear Beatrice, you'll have half the county here. I hope the young couple can bear the scrutiny. Her tone was playful, but her glance at Clara Wentworth was sharp, as if probing for a reaction. Clara, seated beside Julian Ashford, offered a polite smile. I'm sure it will be lovely, she said, her voice soft but with that faint, unplaceable accent Dr. Heywood had noted earlier. She toyed with a silver spoon, her fingers betraying a slight tremor. Julian, ever attentive, placed a hand over hers, though Dr. Heywood noticed his smile seemed forced. His eyes flicking toward the church tower as well. Captain Lionel Drake, standing by the terrace railing, had been silent since the bell's toll. Now, he turned abruptly, his weathered face set in a frown. I don't like it, he said, almost to himself. That bell hasn't rung for no reason in my memory. Last time was old Lord Ashford's funeral, 10 years ago. Oh, do stop, Lionel, Mrs. Carver said, waving a hand. You'll have us all imagining ghosts. It was likely Mr. Gibbs being careless. Gibbs is never careless, Captain Drake retorted, his voice low but firm. He's been sexton for 40 years. Knows that bell like his own heartbeat. Dr. Heywood, listening intently, made a mental note of the captain's insistence. He glanced at Miss Lydia Prescott, who sat slightly apart, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the teapot as if it held some great secret. Young Tommy Ashford, meanwhile, had abandoned his model aeroplane and was now pacing the terrace, his schoolboy energy barely contained. I say, what if it's a warning? He burst out. Like in those stories where a bell rings before someone dies, Tommy. That's enough, Lady Beatrice snapped, her tone sharper than intended. She softened it with a smile. Let us not indulge in childish fancies. Dr. Heywood, you've been quiet. What do you make of this nonsense about the bell? Dr. Heywood set down his cup, choosing his words carefully. I confess, it's curious, he said. The bell's toll was precise to rings, no more, at exactly 4 p.m. Mr. Gibbs is indeed meticulous. Perhaps someone should inquire at the church. A capital idea, Mr. Reginald Poole said, speaking for the first time since tea began. The solicitor's voice was crisp, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the church. I'll go myself after tea. Settle this foolishness before it spoils the weekend. Dr. Heywood noted the edge in Poole's tone, as if the bell's toll were a personal affront. He also observed Clara's sudden stillness at Poole's words, her spoon now motionless in her hand. The group fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the clink of china and the distant call of a cuckoo at 4:45 p.m. As the tea things were cleared, Mr. Poole excused himself to visit the church. Captain Drake offered to accompany him, citing a need for fresh air, and the two men set off across the meadow. Dr. Heywood watched them go, noting the time on his pocket watch. The rest of the party dispersed. Lady Beatrice to confer with the butler, Mrs. Carver to her room to rest, and Miss Prescott to the library. Her steps hurried. Julian and Clara remained on the terrace, their heads bent in whispered conversation, while Tommy darted off to explore the grounds. Dr. Heywood lingered, his physician's instincts attuned to the subtle signs of distress. He was about to return to the village when a cry rang out from the direction of the church. It was sharp, urgent, and unmistakably Captain Drake's voice. Without hesitation, Dr. Heywood hurried across the meadow, his heart pounding. He reached the churchyard at 5:05 p.m., where he found Captain Drake kneeling beside a prone figure near the base of the church tower. It was Mr. Reginald Poole, his face ashen, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. A thin trickle of blood seeped from a wound at his temple, and his right hand clutched a crumpled piece of paper. Above them, the bell of St. Mary's hung silent, its rope still swaying slightly, as if it had been pulled moments before. "Good God," Captain Drake muttered, his voice hoarse. "He's dead, Haywood. Struck down, not 5 minutes after we arrived." Dr. Haywood knelt beside the body, his fingers searching for a pulse. There was none. He glanced at the paper in Poole's hand, a torn fragment with the words "Phantom." Bell scrawled in hasty ink. The time, the bell, the paper all seemed to converge in a puzzle Dr. Haywood could not yet unravel. "Stay here," he told Captain Drake. "I'll fetch help. And don't touch anything." As he hurried back to Bell Manor to raise the alarm, Dr. Haywood's mind raced. The bell's toll at 4 p.m. had been no accident. Someone had rung it, and now someone had killed Reginald Poole. The quiet village of St. Mary's Bell was no longer a place of peace, it was a stage for murder. Chapter 3. The arrival of Miss Marple. News of Reginald Poole's death spread through Bell Manor with the speed of a spark in dry grass, igniting whispers and fearful glances among the guests. By 5:30 p.m., the quiet of St. Mary's Bell had been shattered, replaced by the clamor of urgent voices and the crunch of gravel as Dr. Arthur Haywood returned to the manor to summon help. The local constable, Mr. Burrows, was sent for, and the manor's telephone buzzed with calls to the county police. Yet, as Dr. Haywood stood in the drawing room, recounting the grim discovery to Lady Beatrice and the assembled guests, he felt an unshakable sense that the village needed more than a constable's plodding investigation. Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, sat rigidly in her armchair, her hands clasped tightly. "This is dreadful," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "Mr. Poole was a guest under my roof. How could such a thing happen?" Mrs. Evelyn Carver, perched on the edge of a settee, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes wide with theatrical horror. "Murdered in our own churchyard. Oh, Beatrice, what will the village say?" Julian Ashford stood by the fireplace, his arm around Clara Wentworth, whose face was ashen. "It's unthinkable," Julian said, his voice tight. "Poole was, well, not the most likable fellow, but to be struck down like that." Clara said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Miss Lydia Prescott, hovering near the door, seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes darting nervously. Young Tommy Ashford, unusually subdued, sat cross-legged on the rug, his earlier exuberance replaced by a wide-eyed fascination. Captain Lionel Drake, who had returned with Dr. Haywood, stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his face grim. Dr. Haywood, ever observant, noted the time, 5:45 p.m., and the peculiar silence that followed Julian's words. He was about to suggest sending for a doctor to confirm Poole's death when the butler, Mr. Grimes, entered the room, his expression uncharacteristically flustered. "Madam," he said to Lady Beatrice, "there is a lady at the door, a Miss Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. She says she was passing through and heard of the incident. She insists on speaking with you." Lady Beatrice frowned. "Miss Marple, I don't know her. Passing through at this hour. How peculiar. But show her in, Grimes. We mustn't be rude." Dr. Haywood's curiosity piqued. He had heard of Miss Jane Marple, a spinster of advanced years whose unassuming demeanor belied a remarkable knack for unraveling mysteries. Her reputation had reached even the quiet corners of Devon, whispered in drawing rooms and village shops. Could her arrival, so soon after the murder, be mere chance? Miss Marple entered the drawing room with the quiet grace of a woman accustomed to go in unnoticed. She was small, with white hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her blue eyes sharp, behind gold-rimmed spectacles. Her dress was simple, her wear-upon shawl slightly frayed. Yet there was an air of serene confidence about her. In her hands, she carried a small reticule, and her smile was gentle but probing. Lady Beatrice, I do apologize for intruding, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. I was visiting my old friend, Mrs. Bantry, in the next village, and took a late train to St. Mary's Bell to call on the vicar's wife. I could not help but overhear the villagers speaking of a tragedy at the church. I thought I might offer my assistance, if it's not too bold. Lady Beatrice, momentarily taken aback, recovered her composure. That is kind of you, Miss Marple, but I'm not sure what assistance you could offer. The police are on their way, and Dr. Heywood has the matter in hand. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Of course, but I have found, in my little experience, that a fresh pair of eyes can sometimes see what others miss. Village life, is full of patterns. And when a pattern is broken as with a bell tolling unexpectedly, or a man struck down, it often points to something deeper. Dr. Heywood, standing by the fireplace, felt a stir of admiration. Miss Marple's words were gentle, but they carried a weight of insight. He glanced at the others, noting their reactions, Julian's frown, Clara's sudden stillness, Mrs. Carver's raised eyebrow, Captain Drake's nod of grudging respect, and Miss Prescott's nervous fidgeting. Miss Marple, Dr. Heywood said, stepping forward, I was present when Mr. Poole was found. He was struck on the head, near the church tower, at approximately 5 p.m. Captain Drake was with him. There was a piece of paper in his hand, with the words Phantom Bell written on it. The bell had tolled earlier, at 4 p.m., for no apparent reason. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pursing in thought. A phantom bell, you say? How curious. And the time 4 p.m. You are certain, quite certain? Dr. Heywood replied, consulting his pocket watch. I noted it at the time. Very precise, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. And this paper, may I see it, if it has not been disturbed? Captain Drake spoke up. It's still with the body, Miss Marple. The constables, guarding it until the police arrive. I didn't touch it, as Dr. Heywood instructed. Wise, very wise, Miss Marple said, nodding. The smallest detail can be significant. Tell me, Captain Drake, what brought you and Mr. Poole to the church so promptly after the bell's toll? Drake hesitated, his jaw tightening. Poole wanted to investigate. Said it was nonsense, but he insisted on seeing the sexton. I went along to keep him company. Miss Marple's smile was unchanged, but her eyes lingered on Drake for a moment longer than necessary. I see, she said. And the rest of you were here, at the manor, when the bell tolled. A chorus of affirmations followed, though Dr. Heywood noted the slight delay in Clara's nod and the way Miss Prescott's hands tightened in her lap. Lady Beatrice, eager to assert control, invited Miss Marple to stay until the police arrived. An offer the older woman accepted with a gracious nod. As the group awaited the police, Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes moving from one guest to another, as if knitting together the threads of their reactions. Dr. Heywood, watching her, felt a growing certainty that her presence was no mere coincidence. The bell had tolled. A man was dead, and now Miss Jane Marple was here. Her little gray cells, as a certain Belgian detective might have called them, already at work. Chapter 4. The first questions. Be 6:30 p.m. The drawing room of Bell Manor had taken on the air of a stage awaiting its players, with Miss Jane Marple as the unassuming director. The county police had arrived, led by Inspector Kendall, a stout man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor. He had examined the body of Mr. Reginald Poole in the churchyard, secured the scene, and taken possession of the crumpled paper bearing the words Phantom Bell. Now, he stood in the Manor's drawing room, notebook in hand, addressing the gathered guests while Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. Dr. Arthur Heywood, positioned near the fireplace, observed the scene with his usual attentiveness. The inspector's questions were methodical but blunt, lacking the finesse Dr. Heywood sensed in Miss Marple's earlier inquiries. The guests, still shaken by the murder, sat in a semicircle of unease. Lady Beatrice, regal but tense, Julian, Ashford and Clara Wentworth, close together on a settee, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, fanning herself dramatically, Captain Lionel Drake, stiff and silent, Miss Lydia Prescott, her hands clasped tightly, and young Tommy Ashford, fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. Inspector Kendall cleared his throat. Now, I'll need each of you to account for your movements between 3:30 p.m. and 5 p.m. today. That's the window we're looking at, based on Dr. Heywood's report and the captain's statement. Let's start with you, Lady Beatrice. Lady Beatrice straightened, her voice crisp. I was here, in the Manor, the entire time. After lunch, I was in my study until tea at 4 p.m. on the terrace. I remained there until Dr. Heywood returned with the dreadful news. And you heard the bell toll at 4 p.m.? The inspector pressed. Indeed, she replied. It was most unsettling. I assumed it was an error by Mr. Gibbs, the sexton. The inspector scribbled in his notebook. Mr. Ashford. Julian leaned forward, his charm tempered by a flicker of unease. Clara and I were together, mostly. After lunch, we walked in the gardens until about 3:45 p.m., then joined the others for tea. We were on the terrace when the bell rang. Clara nodded, her voice soft. That's right. We were never apart. Dr. Heywood noted the way Clara's eyes avoided the inspector's, lingering instead on Miss Marple, who continued knitting with an air of serene detachment. He wondered if Miss Marple had noticed it too. Mrs. Carver, Inspector Kendall continued. Oh, it's all so dreadful, Mrs. Carver said, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. I was in my room after lunch, writing letters, until tea. I heard the bell from my window. It gave me quite a start. Miss Prescott? Lydia Prescott's voice was barely audible. I was in the library, arranging some books for Lady Beatrice. I heard the bell, too, and joined the others for tea shortly after. Captain Drake, the inspector asked, turning to the naval officer, who stood rigidly by the window. I was on the terrace from 3:30 p.m., Drake said. I joined Poole when he decided to go to the church after tea. Around 4:45 p.m. we reached the churchyard by 5 p.m., and that's when we found, well, when I found him. And you, young man, the inspector said, eyeing Tommy. Tommy sat up, eager to contribute. I was mucking about in the gardens after lunch, trying to fix my aeroplane. I came in for tea at 4 p.m. and heard the bell. I didn't see Mr. Poole after lunch. Inspector Kendall nodded, then turned to Dr. Heywood. And you, Doctor? I was at my practice until 3:15 p.m., Dr. Heywood said, consulting his pocket watch as if to confirm the habit of precision. I walked to the Manor, arriving around 3:30 p.m. I was with the others for tea when the bell tolled, and I stayed until Captain Drake's cry at 5:05 p.m. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, and Dr. Heywood caught the faintest tilt of her head, as if a detail had snagged her attention. She said nothing, however, and resumed knitting. The inspector closed his notebook. Right. The sexton, Mr. Gibbs, claims he was in his cottage, a quarter-mile from the church, when the bell rang. Says he locked the tower door at noon and didn't return until we summoned him. We'll need to verify that. As for the paper in Poole's hand, phantom bell, it's odd, but it could mean anything. A prank, a warning, or just nonsense. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice gentle but clear. "If I may, Inspector, might I ask a small question, Captain Drake? You said you and Mr. Poole reached the churchyard at 5 p.m. Did you notice the bell rope? Was it still moving when you found the body?" Drake frowned, his hands clenching behind his back. Yes, it was swaying a bit. I didn't think much of it at the time. And the paper. Miss Marple continued, her eyes fixed on her knitting. "Was it in Mr. Poole's right hand or his left?" "Right," Drake said, after a moment's thought. "Definitely his right." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Thank you, Captain. It's just that, in my experience, the smallest details can tell us so much. A bell that rings without a sexton. A paper clutched in a dying man's hand? They are like threads in a tapestry, are they not?" Inspector Kendall looked at her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "You've an interest in this sort of thing, Miss Marple." "Oh, only as an observer of human nature," she replied, her smile disarming. "Village life, you see, is full of little mysteries. One learns to notice patterns." Dr. Haywood, watching closely, sensed that Miss Marple's questions were anything but idle. The bell rope's movement suggested someone had been in the tower shortly before the murder, and the detail of Poole's right hand intrigued him, though he couldn't yet say why. He glanced at the guests, noting Clara's sudden rigidity, Julian's protective arm around her, and Miss Prescott's nervous glance toward the door. Inspector Kendall announced that the guests should remain at the manor pending further inquiries, and the room began to empty. As the others dispersed, Miss Marple approached Dr. Haywood, her voice low. "Dr. Haywood, you are a man who notices things. Might I ask you to keep an eye on our friends here? People reveal so much when they think no one is watching." "Of course," Dr. Haywood replied, intrigued by her trust. "Do you suspect someone already, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "I suspect nothing, Doctor, except that human nature is rarely as simple as it seems. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must speak with Mr. Gibbs about that bell." As Miss Marple glided from the room, her shawl trailing slightly, Dr. Haywood felt a spark of anticipation. The murder of Reginald Poole was no random act, and Miss Marple's quiet presence promised to unravel the threads of deceit woven into the fabric of St. Mary's Bell. Chapter 5. The red herring's evening shadows lengthened across Bell Manor as the clock in the hall chimed 7:30 p.m., casting a somber mood over the household. The guests, confined to the manor by Inspector Kendall's orders, had retreated to their rooms or lingered in small, uneasy groups, their voices hushed as if the walls themselves might betray their secrets. Dr. Arthur Haywood, tasked by Miss Marple to observe, stood in the library, ostensibly browsing a volume of Dickens, but in truth watching the subtle interplay of the manor's occupants. The murder of Reginald Poole, struck down in the churchyard, had stirred a nest of suspicions, and Dr. Haywood sensed that the truth lay buried beneath layers of deception. Inspector Kendall, still at the scene with his constables, had sent word that the preliminary examination suggested Poole had been killed by a single blow to the temple, likely from a blunt object, possibly a stone or a tool from the churchyard. The paper clutched in Poole's right hand, with its cryptic phantom bell, was now in police custody, but its meaning remained elusive. Dr. Haywood, reflecting on Miss Marple's questions about the bell rope and the paper, wondered what threads she was beginning to weave in her mind. In the library, Mrs. Evelyn Carver was holding court near the fireplace, her voice carrying a theatrical edge as she spoke to Captain Lionel Drake. "I always knew Poole was trouble," she declared, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "He had that sharp, greedy look about him. A solicitor, yes, but not the honest sort. I heard he was handling Julian's investments and not well. I might add, Captain Drake, standing with his back to the fire, grunted. Pool was a cold fish, I'll give you that. But murdered? That's a different matter. Whoever did it had to be quick and bold, striking in broad daylight. Dr. Haywood, turning a page he hadn't read, noted the captain's choice of words. Quick and bold qualities. That might describe a naval man accustomed to action. He glanced at Drake's hands, strong and calloused, and wondered if they could wield a weapon with such precision. At that moment, young Tommy Ashford burst into the library, his face flushed with excitement. Dr. Haywood, they've found something. In the churchyard, a wrench, covered in blood. Constable Burrows says it's the murder weapon. Mrs. Carver gasped, her hand flying to her chest. A wrench. How ghastly. Where was it found? Near the hedge, by the tower door, Tommy said, his eyes wide. It's one of old Gibbs's tools, from the shed. Anyone could have taken it. Dr. Haywood frowned, his mind racing. A wrench. From the sexton's shed was an obvious clue to obvious, perhaps. He recalled Miss Marple's earlier comment about patterns, and wondered if this was a deliberate misdirection. Before he could respond, the library door opened, and Miss Jane Marple entered, her shawl neatly draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag in hand. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm, but carrying that gentle authority Dr. Haywood was beginning to recognize. "I've just come from speaking with Mr. Gibbs, a most interesting man." Though quite shaken by the day's events, Mrs. Carver seized the opportunity to redirect her dramatics. "Miss Marple, have you heard? They've found a bloody wrench. Surely that points to the culprit, someone who knew where Gibbs kept his tools." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. "A wrench, you say? How very convenient. And where was Mr. Gibbs, young Tommy, when this wrench was supposedly taken?" Tommy, eager to be useful, replied, "He says he was in his cottage all afternoon, until the police called him. He swears the shed was locked, but the lock's old and flimsy. Anyone could have jimmied it." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes on her knitting, but her mind clearly elsewhere. "And yet, a locked shed, a bloodied wrench, and a bell. That tolls without a sexton. It's all rather theatrical, don't you think?" Dr. Haywood caught the glint in her eye and sensed she was testing the waters, probing for reactions. He glanced at Captain Drake, who had turned to stare out the window, his jaw tight. Mrs. Carver, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the subtext, launching into a tirade about the dangers of leaving tools lying about. The door opened again, admitting Julian Ashford and Clara Wentworth. Julian's face was pale, his usual charm replaced by a strained expression. Clara clung to his arm, her eyes darting nervously. "Inspector Kendall's back," Julian announced. "He's in the hall, talking to Aunt Beatrice. Says he wants to question us against something about Poole's business dealings." Mrs. Carver's eyes gleamed. "Business dealings, I told you, Captain. That man was up to no good." "Julian, what do you know about Poole's affairs?" Julian hesitated, his hand tightening on Clara's. "Not much. He managed some investments for the family stocks, properties. Aunt Beatrice trusted him. But I had my doubts." Clara's voice was barely audible. "He was always so secretive, always watching." Miss Marple's needles paused, and Dr. Haywood saw her gaze flicker toward Clara, though her expression remained serene. "Secretive. Miss Wentworth, in what way?" Clara flushed, as if regretting her words. "Oh, just the way he spoke. Always hinting at things, never saying them outright. An interesting observation," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "People who hint often have something to hide or something they wish others to fear they know." Dr. Haywood noted the sudden silence that followed. Julian's frown deepened, and Captain Drake turned from the window, his eyes narrowing. Mrs. Carver seemed about to speak, but was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Lydia Prescott, who slipped into the room with her usual timidity. I thought I should tell you," Miss Prescott said, her voice trembling. The inspector found something else, a letter in Mr. Poole's room. It was half-written, addressed to Lady Beatrice. Something about a discrepancy in the estate accounts. The room erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Carver's fan snapped shut. A discrepancy. Oh, Beatrice will be furious. Was Poole stealing from her? Miss Marple's voice cut through the chatter, soft but incisive. Miss Prescott, did the inspector say what time the letter was written? Miss Prescott shook her head. No, but it was on his desk, unfinished. The ink was still wet when they found it. Wet ink, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes gleaming. How very curious. And yet, Mr. Poole was at tea with us at 4 p.m. Was he not? When could he have written such a letter? Dr. Haywood's mind raced. The wrench, the letter, the bell, all pointed in different directions, yet Miss Marple seemed to see a pattern where he saw only chaos. He glanced at the clock, 8:15 p.m., and made a mental note to check the timing of Poole's movements more closely. As the group dispersed for dinner, Miss Marple lingered, catching Dr. Haywood's eye. "Doctor," she said quietly, "beware of the obvious. In my experience, the most convenient clues are often the least truthful." Dr. Haywood nodded, his respect for her growing. The wrench and the letter were red herrings, he suspected, designed to mislead. But by whom? And why? The phantom bell's toll seemed to echo in his mind, a warning that the truth was still hidden in the shadows of St. Mary's Bell. Chapter 6. A clue in detailed dining room of Bell Manor, aglow with candlelight. Should have been a scene of elegance, but the events of the day cast a pall over the evening meal. It was 8:45 p.m., and the guests, seated around the polished mahogany table, picked at their food with little appetite. Dr. Arthur Haywood, positioned near the foot of the table, observed the strained faces of the party, their polite conversation unable to mask the undercurrent of fear and suspicion. The murder of Reginald Poole, the cryptic phantom bell, note, the bloodied wrench, and the unfinished letter had woven a web of unease, and Dr. Haywood sensed that Miss Jane Marple, seated demurely to his left, was quietly untangling its thread. Stopped Miss Marple, her napkin folded neatly in her lap, ate sparingly, her eyes flitting from one guest to another with the alertness of a bird. She had said little since her cryptic warning to Dr. Haywood about convenient clues, but her silence was anything but idle. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, maintained a facade of composure, though her fork trembled slightly as she addressed the group. "I trust Inspector Kendall will resolve this dreadful matter swiftly," she said, her voice firm. "We must not let this tragedy overshadow Julian and Clara's engagement." Julian Ashford, seated beside Clara Wentworth, forced a smile. "Of course, and Beatrice, though I confess, it's hard to think of celebrations with Poole's death so fresh." Clara, pale and silent, nodded, her eyes fixed on her untouched plate. Dr. Haywood noted the way her fingers gripped her water glass, the knuckles whitening briefly before she relaxed them. Across the table, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, ever eager for gossip, leaned forward. "I heard the inspector suspects a vagrant. Some tramp lurking in the churchyard, perhaps, who stole Gibbs's wrench and struck Poole down." Captain Lionel Drake, cutting his roast with precision, snorted. "Nonsense, Evelyn. A vagrant wouldn't write phantom bell on a scrap of paper." This was someone who knew Poole, someone with a grudge. Miss Lydia Prescott, seated beside Mrs. Carver, flinched at the mention of the note, her fork clattering against her plate. "Oh, please, she murmured, must we speak of it? It's too horrible. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, broke the tension. Miss Prescott, you seem distressed. Did you know Mr. Poole well? Lydia's eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. No, not well. He was Lady Beatrice's solicitor. I only spoke to him about household matters. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her gaze sharp. Of course, and yet, you mentioned the letter found in his room, such a curious detail. The ink still wet. It suggests he wrote it just before he left for the church. Does it not? Dr. Heywood, listening intently, caught the subtle shift in the room. Julian's jaw tightened, and Clara's glass trembled slightly. Lady Beatrice's lips pursed, as if the mention of the letter displeased her. Young Tommy Ashford, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, piped up. Maybe he was writing it when the bell rang. That's why he went to the church to catch whoever rang it. Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought to the table in her ever-present knitting bag, clicked softly as she set them aside. An interesting theory, Tommy, she said. But let us consider the bell itself. Mr. Gibbs insists the tower door was locked. Yet the rope was swaying when Captain Drake and Mr. Poole arrived, and the wrench found so conveniently by the hedge. Tell me, Captain, did you notice anything else near the body? A footprint, perhaps, or a disturbed patch of grass? Captain Drake paused, his knife hovering above his plate. Nothing specific, he said slowly. The ground was dry, but now that you mention it, there was a bit of mud on the path near the tower door. Not much, just a smear, like someone had stepped in it. Mud, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes gleaming. How curious, in this dry weather. And where might this mud have come from? I wonder. Dr. Heywood's mind raced. The churchyard was bordered by a meadow, and the path to the tower was gravel, not prone to mud unless someone had come from the nearby stream or the manor's gardens, where the soil was looser. He glanced at the guests, noting their shoes clean, for the most part, though Clara's low heels bore a faint trace of dirt, barely noticeable in the candlelight. Before he could dwell on this, the butler, Mr. Grimes, entered with a tray of dessert, his face pale. Pardon, madam, he said to Lady Beatrice, but Inspector Kendall has returned. He wishes to speak with you privately about Mr. Poole's letter. Lady Beatrice's expression hardened. Very well. Show him to my study. She rose, excusing herself, and the room fell silent in her wake. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Heywood, her voice low. Doctor, you mentioned the paper in Mr. Poole's hand. Did you notice the handwriting? Was it neat or hurried? Dr. Heywood frowned, recalling the brief glimpse he'd had before the police took it. Hurried, I'd say. The letters were uneven, almost scrawled. Scrawled, Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. And in his right hand, as Captain Drake confirmed. Yet Mr. Poole, I understand, was left-handed. Dr. Heywood started, the detail catching him off guard. Left-handed, I didn't know. A small thing, Miss Marple said, her smile faint. But in my experience, the smallest things are often the most telling. A man does not clutch a note in his weaker hand unless it was placed there or unless he was trying to tell us something. The room seemed to close in around Dr. Heywood as he processed her words. The wrench, the letter, the mud, the handwriting, each was a clue. But only Miss Marple seemed to see how they might connect. He glanced at the others, Julian, whispering to Clara, Mrs. Carver, watching them with narrowed eyes, Miss Prescott, staring at her plate, and Captain Drake, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle's dot as dessert was served. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with rhythmic precision. Dr. Heywood, she said softly, keep your eyes on the little things. A smear of mud. A scrawled note, a bell that tolls at 4 p.m. They are like stitches in a pattern. Pull one, and the whole may unravel. Dr. Haywood nodded, his respect for her deepening. The murder of Reginald Pole was no simple crime, and the clue of the left-handed man clutching a note in his right hand was a thread Miss Marple was already tugging. The phantom bell's echo lingered, and Dr. Haywood felt certain that more secrets would soon surface in the quiet village of St. Mary's Bell. Chapter 7. More lies surfaces. Clock in Bell Manor's hall struck 10 p.m., its chimes resonating through the quiet house like a distant echo of the church bell that had tolled so ominously at 4 p.m. The guests, still under Inspector Kendall's directive to remain, had retired to the drawing room after dinner, where the air was thick with unspoken accusations. Dr. Arthur Haywood, seated near a window overlooking the darkened meadow, felt the weight of the evening's revelations, the bloodied wrench, the unfinished letter, and Miss Marple's startling observation about Reginald Pole's left-handedness. Each clue seemed to point in a different direction, yet Miss Jane Marple, knitting quietly in her corner, appeared to see a pattern emerging. Lady Beatrice had returned from her meeting with Inspector Kendall, her face drawn, but her composure intact. She sat by the fireplace, her hands folded tightly, as if anchoring herself against the storm of suspicion. The others were scattered about the room, Julian Ashford and Clara Wentworth on a settee, their hands clasped. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, fanning herself with exaggerated distress, Captain Lionel Drake, pacing near the bookcase, Miss Lydia Prescott, perched nervously on a chair, and young Tommy Ashford sprawled on the rug, sketching the church tower with a pencil. Inspector Kendall had left to confer with his constables, but his earlier questions had stirred unease. The letter found in Poole's room, half-written and addressed to Lady Beatrice about a discrepancy in the estate accounts, had cast a shadow over the household. Dr. Haywood, ever observant, noted the way Lady Beatrice's eyes avoided the others, as if guarding a secret of her own. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, broke the silence. Lady Beatrice, if I may be so bold, what was the nature of this discrepancy Mr. Poole mentioned in his letter? It seems a matter of some importance, given the circumstances. Lady Beatrice's lips tightened, but her voice remained steady. It was a trifling matter, Miss Marple. A question of investments, some shares Mr. Poole managed for the estate. He believed there was an error in the accounting, but I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Carver's fan snapped shut. A misunderstanding? Beatrice, surely you don't mean to say Poole was dishonest? Though I wouldn't put it past him. He had that sly look, always prying into everyone's affairs. Julian shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on Clara's. Poole was thorough. I'll give him that. But he could be overzealous. I told Aunt Beatrice he was pushing for risky investments. Clara's voice, soft but strained, cut in. He asked me questions, too, about my family, my past. Things that had nothing to do with the estate. Dr. Haywood's ears pricked up. Clara's admission was new, and he saw Miss Marple's needles pause briefly, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. Questions, Miss Wentworth, Miss Marple said gently. What sort of questions? Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to Julian. He wanted to know about my parents, where I grew up. He said it was for the marriage settlement, but it felt personal, almost threatening. Julian's face darkened. I told him to leave Clara alone. He had no business meddling in her life. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind clearly at work. How curious. A solicitor who probes beyond his duties often has a motive of his own. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, did you confront Mr. Poole about this? Julian flushed, his jaw tightening. I did. Yesterday, after dinner, I told him to stick to the estate's finances and leave Clara out of it. He laughed it off, said he was only being thorough. Dr. Haywood noted the edge in Julian's voice, a mix of anger and defensiveness. He glanced at Captain Drake, who had stopped pacing and was watching Julian with a hard stare. Miss Prescott, meanwhile, seemed to shrink further into her chair, her hands twisting her handkerchief. Mrs. Carver seized the moment to fan the flames. A confrontation. Julian, you didn't tell us you argued with Poole, and now he's dead, struck down in the churchyard. Oh, it's too dreadful to think about. Evelyn, that's enough, Captain Drake snapped, his voice sharp. Julian's not the only one who disliked Poole. The man had a knack for making enemies. I saw him arguing with Lydia in the garden yesterday morning. Miss Prescott gasped, her face paling. It wasn't an argument, she stammered. He asked about the household accounts, that's all. I told him everything was in order. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her eyes were fixed on Miss Prescott. And was everything in order, Miss Prescott? A solicitor's questions can be most unsettling, especially when they touch on matters we'd rather keep private. Miss Prescott's hands trembled, and she looked away. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I only manage the household books. There was nothing to hide. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Dr. Haywood, watching closely, saw Clara's eyes dart toward Miss Prescott, then away, as if something in the exchange had struck a chord. He made a mental note of the time, 10:15 p.m. and the growing web of lies, Julian's confrontation, Clara's unease, Prescott's defensiveness, and the mysterious letter. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice soft but piercing. It is remarkable, is it not? How much can be hidden behind a polite facade? In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who kept her accounts meticulously, yet omitted one small detail, a loan she could not repay. It led to quite a scandal. Small secrets, you see, have a way of growing. Lady Beatrice stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This speculation is unseemly, she said. Miss Marple, I appreciate your interest, but we must leave this to the police. I suggest we all retire for the night. The guests murmured agreement, but as they dispersed, Dr. Haywood caught Miss Marple's eye. She gave him a slight nod, as if to say the real work was just beginning. He lingered in the drawing room, his mind churning over the new revelations, Julian's argument with Poole, Clara's fear of his questions, and Miss Prescott's nervous denial. The letter about the estate's accounts, with its wet ink, suggested Poole had uncovered something worth killing for. But what? As he walked to his guest room, Dr. Haywood paused by a window, glancing at the church tower across the meadow. The bell was silent now, but its earlier toll seemed to echo in his mind, a reminder that the truth was still out of reach. Miss Marple, he was certain, had already begun to unravel the lies, and he resolved to watch closely for the next thread to surface. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Bell Manor, casting a pale light over the breakfast room where the guests gathered at 8 a.m. on Wednesday, August 13, 1935. The air was heavy with the unspoken weight of Reginald Poole's murder, and the clink of silverware against china did little to dispel the tension. Dr. Arthur Haywood, seated at the far end of the table, sipped his coffee and observed the strained faces around him. The revelations of the previous night, Julian Ashford's confrontation with Poole, Clara Wentworth's fear of his probing questions, and Miss Lydia Prescott's nervous denial about the household accounts, had tightened the web of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated across from him, buttered her toast with delicate precision, her blue eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the table, maintained her usual air of authority, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she poured tea. Julian and Clara sat close together, their faces pale, while Mrs. Evelyn Carver, ever the gossip, whispered to Captain Lionel Drake about the village's growing rumors. Miss Prescott, her eyes red-rimmed, picked at her food, and young Tommy Ashford, usually so lively, was subdued, his gaze fixed on his plate. Dr. Haywood's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Kendall, who entered the room with a purposeful stride, his notebook in hand. "Good morning," he said, his tone brisk. "I've new information that may shed light on Mr. Pole's death. We've confirmed the wrench was indeed the murder weapon, traces of blood and hair match pools. But more importantly, we've traced the paper found in his hand. The Phantom Bell note was torn from a sheet in his own notebook, kept in his room." A murmur rippled through the group. Mrs. Carver's eyes widened. His own notebook. Then he wrote it himself. "Possibly," Inspector Kendall said, his mustache twitching. "But the handwriting is shaky, unlike his usual neat script, and the ink matches the pen found on his desk, where the letter about the estate accounts was written. We're also looking into his financial dealings. Seems he was involved in some questionable transactions, not just with the Ashford estate." Lady Beatrice's cup clattered against its saucer. "Questionable transactions, Inspector? I trusted Mr. Pole implicitly. If there were irregularities I was not aware of them." Miss Marple, setting down her toast, spoke softly. "Inspector, might I ask if the notebook was found in Mr. Pole's room or elsewhere?" "In his room," Kendall replied, eyeing her curiously. "Locked in his briefcase, though the lock was forced open." "Forced?" Miss Marple repeated, her voice thoughtful. "And the letter about the estate accounts didn't mention any specific sum or a particular transaction?" Kendall hesitated, then shook his head. "It was vague, only hinting at a discrepancy. But we're digging deeper. Pole had enemies, it seems, beyond this house." The room fell silent, and Dr. Haywood noted the way each guest reacted. Julian's jaw tightened, Clara's hands clenched in her lap, Captain Drake's eyes narrowed, and Miss Prescott's face crumpled. It was then that Miss Prescott, with a sudden, choked sob, pushed back her chair and stood. "I can't bear it any longer," she cried, her voice breaking. "I knew about the accounts. Mr. Pole came to me 2 days ago, saying he'd found an error sum of £5,000 missing from the estate's trust fund. He thought I'd taken it." The room froze. Lady Beatrice's face turned ashen. "Lydia, what are you saying? You stole from me?" "No," Miss Prescott sobbed, her hands wringing her handkerchief. "I didn't take it. I told him the books were correct, but he wouldn't listen. He said he'd tell you, Lady Beatrice, unless I explained it. I was terrified. I've no money, no family. If I lost my place here..." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "Miss Prescott, why did you not mention this sooner? Fear is a powerful motive, but so is honesty." Miss Prescott's tears flowed freely. "I was ashamed and frightened. Mr. Pole was so relentless. He kept asking about my past, my savings. I thought he was trying to trap me." Julian stood, his face flushed with anger. "Pole was a bully. He tried the same with Clara, digging into her life. If he was blackmailing Lydia, who else was he? Tormenting?" Clara's voice, barely audible, cut through the tension. "He asked me about my father," she whispered. "Said he knew something that could ruin me." Dr. Haywood's heart quickened. Clara's admission, coupled with Miss Prescott's outburst, painted a picture of Pole as a man who wielded knowledge like a weapon. He glanced at Miss Marple, whose needles had stilled, her gaze fixed on Clara. "Miss Wentworth, Miss Marple said gently. What did Mr. Poole claim to know about your father? Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. I don't know. He wouldn't say. Just hinted that it was shameful. I told Julian, and he was furious. Julian nodded, his voice tight. I told Poole to back off, as I said last night. But I didn't kill him, if that's what anyone's thinking. Captain Drake, who had been silent, spoke up, his voice gruff. Poole was a leech. Sounds like he was squeezing half the room. But blackmail doesn't explain the bell, or that note in his hand. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind clearly racing. Indeed, Captain, the bell and the note are most curious. A man who blackmails often meets a bad end. But the manner of this and the bell tolling, the note scrawled in a shaky hand suggests a deeper purpose. Miss Prescott, when you spoke with Mr. Poole, did he mention the bell at all? Miss Prescott shook her head, wiping her eyes. No, never, only the accounts, and he asked if I'd ever been to the church tower. The room stilled. Dr. Haywood's mind raced the church tower, the swaying rope, the mud near the door. He saw Miss Marple's eyes gleam, as if a piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Inspector Kendall, sensing the shift, cleared his throat. Miss Prescott, you'll need to come with me for a full statement. The rest of you, stay put. We're not done here. As Miss Prescott was led away, sobbing quietly, Miss Marple turned to Dr. Haywood, her voice low. Doctor, the heart of this mystery lies in what people fear to lose. Miss Prescott fears her position. Miss Wentworth her reputation. But the bell, that is something else entirely. Keep watching, my dear doctor. The truth is often in the silences. Dr. Haywood nodded, his respect for her insight deepening. The emotional confessions had cracked open the facade of Bell Manor, revealing blackmail and fear. But the phantom, Bell's toll, and the note in Poole's right hand despite his left-handedness remained unanswered. And Dr. Haywood sensed that Miss Marple was closer to unraveling the truth than anyone realized. Chapter 9. The trapped morning of August 13, 1935, had given way to a gray, overcast afternoon, the clouds casting a somber veil over Bell Manor. By 2 p.m., the drawing room was once again the stage for a tense gathering, as Inspector Kendall had summoned the household to discuss the latest findings in Reginald Poole's murder. Dr. Arthur Haywood, standing near the tall windows overlooking the meadow, felt the weight of the previous night's confessions miss. Lydia Prescott's admission of Poole's accusations, and Clara Wentworth's revelation of his blackmail hanging over the room, like a storm waiting to break. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, appeared serene, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, and Dr. Haywood sensed she was preparing to tighten the net around the killer. Inspector Kendall stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his expression grim. The guests were assembled. Lady Beatrice, rigid with dignity, Julian Ashford, and Clara, their hands clasped tightly, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, her fan idol for once, Captain Lionel Drake, his face set in a scowl, Miss Prescott, pale and trembling, and young Tommy Ashford, perched on the edge of a chair, his eyes wide with anticipation. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and Dr. Haywood noted the time to 05 p.m. As the inspector began, "We've made progress," Kendall said, his voice cutting through the silence. Miss Prescott's statement about the missing £5 has led us to examine Mr. Poole's financial records. It seems he was not only managing the Ashford estate, but also handling investments for several clients, some of whom lost significant sums. We found correspondence in his room suggesting he was pressuring certain individuals possibly for personal gain. Mrs. Carver gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat. Blackmail, Then, I knew he was a scoundrel. Who was he targeting, Inspector? Kendall's mustache twitched. I'm not at liberty to say, Mrs. Carver. But we're also looking into the Phantom Bell note. The paper matches Poole's notebook, but the handwriting is still under Whodunit, and the wrench Gibbs confirmed it was his, but he swears the shed was locked. Someone had access, someone who knew the churchyard well. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, and she spoke without looking up. Inspector, might I ask if you've examined the church tower itself? The rope was swaying, Captain Drake said, and there was mud near the door. It seems to me that whoever rang the bell at 4 p.m. may have left more than mud behind. Kendall frowned, clearly unused to such interruptions, but nodded. We searched the tower this morning. Found nothing unusual, except, well, a small piece of cloth caught on a nail near the top of the stairs. Blue wool, looks like, could be from anyone's clothing. Dr. Haywood's eyes darted to the guests, recalling their attire. Clara's dress yesterday had been a pale blue, and Miss Prescott often wore a navy shawl. He glanced at Miss Marple, who gave the faintest nod, as if she, too, had noted the clue. Captain Drake spoke up, his voice gruff. A bit of cloth means nothing. The tower's old, full of snags. Could have been there for weeks. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but pointed. But in my experience, Captain, the smallest threads can lead to the largest truths. Let us consider the bell itself. It tolled at precisely 4 p.m., yet Mr. Gibbs was in his cottage. Someone entered the tower, rang the bell, and left possibly in haste, given the mud and the cloth. And then, within an hour, Mr. Poole was dead, clutching a note he did not write in his usual hand. The room stilled, the weight of her words settling over the group. Dr. Haywood saw Clara's hand tighten on Julian's, and Miss Prescott's eyes flicker toward the door. Lady Beatrice's face was unreadable, but her fingers gripped the arms of her chair. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her gaze sweeping the room. I propose a small experiment, she said. Let us gather in the churchyard, near the tower, at 4 p.m. today, the same hour the bell tolled yesterday. It may help us understand the sequence of events. People, you see, often reveal themselves under pressure, and a return to the scene may stir something loose. Inspector Kendall hesitated, then nodded. Very well, Miss Marple. I see no harm in it. But I'll have my men there, watching. The group agreed, though reluctance was evident in their faces, as they dispersed to prepare. Dr. Haywood approached Miss Marple, his voice low. You're setting a trap, aren't you? To see who reacts. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. My dear doctor, I am merely observing. But people are like birds in a garden disturbed their perch, and they may fly in unexpected directions. At 4 p.m., the group assembled in the churchyard, the tower looming above them under the gray sky. Inspector Kendall and 2 constables stood nearby, their eyes sharp. Mr. Gibbs, the sexton, was present, his weathered face anxious as he unlocked the tower door. The bell hung silent, its rope still, but the air felt charged, as if the phantom toll might sound again. Miss Marple, standing near the tower entrance, addressed the group. Let us imagine the moment. At 4 p.m. yesterday, someone entered this tower, rang the bell, and left. Mr. Poole, perhaps curious, went to investigate, and within an hour, he was dead. Captain Drake, you were with him. Can you show us exactly where you stood? Drake, his face tense, stepped forward, pointing to a spot near the tower door. Here. Poole was just ahead, by the hedge. I heard a rustle, then a thud, and found him. Like that. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the ground. And the mud. Inspector, where was it? Kendall pointed to a patch near the door, now dry but marked by a faint discoloration. Here. Not much, but enough to notice. Clara, standing close to Julian, shivered. It's horrible. Standing here where it happened. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice was firm. Miss Wentworth, you were on the terrace at 4 p.m., were you not? Did you see anyone cross the meadow toward the church? Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to Julian. No. I wasn't looking. I was talking to Julian. Julian nodded quickly. We were together. As I said, Miss Prescott, standing apart, suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I saw something, she whispered. Yesterday, before tea, I looked out the library window. There was someone in the meadow, moving toward the church. I couldn't see who it was, just a shadow. The group turned to her, and Dr. Haywood saw Miss Marple's eyes gleam. A shadow, Miss Prescott, she said. How very interesting. And what time was this? Just before 4 p.m., Miss Prescott said, her voice trembling. I thought it was nothing. Just a gardener, perhaps. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Nothing is ever quite nothing, Miss Prescott. A shadow, a bell, a note, they all point somewhere. As the group stood in the churchyard, the tension was palpable. Dr. Haywood felt the trap closing, Miss Marple's questions stirring reactions that betrayed guilt, fear, or both. The phantom bell remained silent, but its echo seemed to reverberate, drawing the truth closer to the surface. Chapter 10. The revealed churchyard of St. Mary's Bell, bathed in the dim light of the overcast afternoon, seemed to hold its breath as the group stood near the tower at 4:15 p.m. on August 13th, 1935. Miss Jane Marple's experiment recreating the moment of the phantom bell's toll had stirred a palpable unease among the guests of Bell Manor. Miss Lydia Prescott's admission of seeing a shadow in the meadow just before 4 p.m. yesterday hung in the air, and Dr. Arthur Haywood, standing near the hedge where Reginald Poole's body had been found, felt the tension coiling tighter. Miss Marple, her shawl neatly draped, stood by the tower door, her calm demeanor masking the sharp mind that Dr. Haywood knew was piecing together the final threads of the mystery. Inspector Kendall, flanked by his constables, cleared his throat. Miss Marple, this has been enlightening, but I'm not sure what we've gained. A shadow in the meadow could be anyone, villager, gardener, or no one at all. We need hard evidence. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly behind her spectacles. Evidence, Inspector, is often in the details we overlook. A shadow, a bell, a note clutched in the wrong hand, they are like pieces of a puzzle. Shall we return to the manor? I believe it is time to lay out the picture. The group, murmuring uneasily, followed her back to Bell Manor, where they reconvened. In the drawing room by 4:45 p.m. the room, with its heavy curtains and flickering fire, felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Lady Beatrice sat rigidly in her armchair. Julian and Clara clung to each other on the settee. Mrs. Evelyn Carver clutched her fan. Captain Lionel Drake stood by the window. Miss Prescott twisted her handkerchief, and young Tommy Ashford perched on the rug, his eyes wide. Dr. Haywood took his place near the fireplace, his notebook open, ready to record Miss Marple's deductions. Miss Marple stood before the group, her small frame commanding attention. My friends, she began, her voice soft but clear. The murder of Mr. Reginald Poole is a crime of calculation, not passion. Let us begin with the bell. At precisely 4 p.m. yesterday, it tolled twice, though Mr. Gibbs, the sexton, was in his cottage, and the tower door was locked. The rope was swaying when Captain Drake and Mr. Poole arrived at 5 p.m., and a smear of mud was found near the door. along with a piece of blue wool caught on a nail in the tower. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. The bell was no accident. Someone rang it to lure Mr. Poole to the churchyard. But who and why? Let us consider the note, Phantom Bell, scrawled in a shaky hand, clutched in Mr. Poole's right hand, though he was left-handed. This suggests the note was placed there, perhaps to mislead us. And then there is the wrench, conveniently found by the hedge, and the letter in Poole's room. Its ink still wet, hinting at a discrepancy in the estate accounts. Double quotes Mrs. Carver interrupted, her voice sharp. It's obvious. Poole was blackmailing someone, Lydia, or Clara, or even Julian. One of them snapped. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. Patience, Mrs. Carver. Blackmail is indeed at the heart of this, but the truth lies in the timing and the details. Let us reconstruct the day. At 3:30 p.m., Dr. Haywood arrived. At the manor, at 4 p.m., the bell tolled, and all of you claim to have been on the terrace for tea, except Miss Prescott, who was in the library, and Mr. Poole, who was. Where she turned to Captain Drake. You said Mr. Poole was with you on the terrace until 4:45 p.m., when you both went to the church. Yet Miss Prescott saw a shadow in the meadow just before 4 o'clock p.m. Someone was at the tower, ringing the bell. And the mud, the wool, these suggest a hasty exit. Clara's voice trembled. But why would anyone ring the bell? It makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, Miss Marple said, if the bell was a signal not for Mr. Poole, but for someone else. Mr. Poole, you see, was a man who pried. He questioned Miss Wentworth about her past, accused Miss Prescott of theft, and hinted at financial irregularities to Lady Beatrice. But his true target was someone who feared exposure above all else. She turned to Lady Beatrice, whose face had paled. Lady Beatrice, the letter about the £5,000 discrepancy was a ruse, was it not? Mr. Poole discovered something far more damaging, a secret you could not afford to let out. Lady Beatrice's hands gripped her chair. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. Oh, but I think you do, Miss Marple said softly. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once knew a lady who hid a youthful indiscretion, a child born out of wedlock, sent away to protect her reputation. Your nephew, Julian, is not your nephew, is he? He is your son, born in secret, raised as your brother's child to preserve the Ashford name. Mr. Poole uncovered this, perhaps through old letters or records, and threatened to reveal it unless you paid him. The room gasped. Julian stood, his face white. That's absurd, Aunt Beatrice. Tell her it's nonsense. But Lady Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, and her voice broke. It's true, she whispered. Julian is my son. I was young, foolish. I sent him to my brother to raise as his own. Poole found out he had documents, letters. He demanded £10,000, or he'd ruin us. Miss Marple nodded. And so, you acted. You rang the bell at 4 p.m. as a signal to someone, perhaps a trusted ally, to confront Poole. But something went wrong. Poole was killed, and the note was placed in his hand to suggest a mysterious phantom bell killer. Diverting suspicion, Captain. Drake stepped forward, his voice hoarse. You're wrong, Miss Marple. Beatrice couldn't have done it. She was on the terrace, was she? Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. The terrace is visible from the library window, where Miss Prescott was. Yet Miss Prescott saw a shadow in the meadow. Lady Beatrice, your blue shawl might it have caught on a nail in the tower. As you hurried down, Lady Beatrice's hand flew to her throat, where her shawl was absent. I lost it yesterday. She stammerd. Miss Marple's voice softened. You meant only to scare Poole, I think. But you're a lie, perhaps someone loyal. Like Mr. Grimes, the butler misunderstood. He struck Poole with the wrench, thinking to protect you. The note was an afterthought, scrawled to mislead, but placed in the wrong hand. Grimes, standing silently by the door, flinched. Inspector Kendall turned to him, his eyes narrowing. Grimes, is this true? The butler's face crumpled. I only meant to warn him, sir. He was ruining her ladyship. I followed him to the churchyard, took the wrench. It was a moment's madness. Lady Beatrice sobbed, and Julian rushed to her side. Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but unwavering. The bell was your signal, Lady Beatrice, but it became a death knell, in my experience. Secrets kept to long breed tragedy. Dr. Haywood, his heart pounding, marveled at her logic. The bell, the note, the will all had pointed to Lady Beatrice's desperate act, executed by a loyal servant. The phantom bell had signaled death, and Miss Marple had unraveled its truth. Chapter 11. The reflection the drawing room of Bell Manor. Bathed in the fading light of the late afternoon on August 13, 1935, felt emptier despite the presence of its occupants. The revelation of Lady Beatrice's secret and Mr. Grimes's confession to the murder of Reginald Poole had left the guests in a state of quiet shock. Inspector Kendall had taken Grimes into custody, his face a mask of grim resolve as he led the butler away. Lady Beatrice, supported by Julian Ashford, had retired to her room, her composure shattered by the weight of her exposed past. The others, Clara, Wentworth, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, Captain Lionel Drake, Miss Lydia Prescott, and young Tommy Ashford remained in the drawing room, their faces reflecting a mix of relief, guilt, and unease. Dr. Arthur Haywood stood by the fireplace, his notebook closed, his mind still reeling from Miss Jane Marple's meticulous unraveling of the crime. The phantom bell, the scrawled note, the blue wool, the mud, all had been pieces of a puzzle only she had seen clearly. Miss Marple herself sat in her corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her expression serene, but tinged with a quiet sadness. The clock on the mantel read 5:30 p.m., and the silence in the room was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Carver, her fan idol in her lap, was the first to speak. Miss Marple, I confess I thought you a meddlesome old woman, but you've a mind like a steel trap. How did you know it was Lady Beatrice and poor Grimes? Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her blue eyes gentle but piercing. My dear Mrs. Carver, it is not so much a matter of knowing as of observing. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I have seen many secrets kept for the sake of pride or love. Lady Beatrice's secret, her son, Julian, was the heart of this tragedy. Mr. Poole's blackmail threatened to destroy her, and she acted out of fear. The bell was her signal, a desperate attempt to protect her name, but it led to a greater sin. Clara, her voice trembling, spoke softly. But why the note? Why phantom bell? Miss Marple's smile was faint. The note, Miss Wentworth, was a clumsy attempt to mislead. Mr. Grimes, in his panic, wrote it to suggest a mysterious killer, hoping to divert suspicion from his mistress. But he placed it in Mr. Poole's right hand, forgetting or perhaps not knowing that Poole was left-handed. It was a small error, but in my experience, it is the small errors that betray us. Dr. Haywood, listening intently, marveled at her precision. And the blue wool, Miss Marple. How did you connect it to Lady Beatrice's shawl? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A simple matter of observation, doctor. I noticed Lady Beatrice's shawl on the first evening, a fine blue, wool, slightly frayed at the edges. When Inspector Kendall mentioned the cloth in the tower, I recalled her missing it yesterday. The tower stairs are narrow. The nail sharp. It was not hard to imagine it catching as she hurried down after ringing the bell. Captain Drake, who had been silent, cleared his throat. I should have seen it. I was with Poole when he died, and I missed it all, the mud, the rope, everything. Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. Do not blame yourself, Captain. The human heart is a complex thing, and we are often blind to what is closest to us. Lady Beatrice acted out of love for her son, and Mr. Grimes out of loyalty to her. It is a sad business, but not an uncommon one. Miss Prescott, her eyes still red from tears, spoke hesitantly. I feel so foolish, Miss Marple. I thought Poole suspected me of stealing, but it was all to distract from his real target. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Miss Prescott. Mr. Poole was a man who used fear as a weapon, sowing doubt to hide his true purpose. But fear, you see, has a way of unraveling itself. Tommy, sitting cross-legged on the rug, looked up with wide eyes. Will Lady Beatrice be arrested, too? She didn't kill anyone. Miss Marple's expression softened. That is for the law to decide, Tommy. But I suspect Inspector Kendall will see her actions as a mother's desperation, not a murderer's intent. Mr. Grimes, I fear, will face a heavier judgment. Dr. Haywood, moved by her words, spoke quietly. Miss Marple, you've shown us how much lies beneath the surface. But what made you so certain the bell was a signal? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. In St. Mary Mead, Doctor, I once knew a gardener who rang the church bell to signal his wife when his work was done. Bells are for calling. You see, calling to worship, to mourn, or to act. The bell at 4 p.m. was no accident. It was Lady Beatrice's call to Grimes, a signal to confront Poole. But human nature is unpredictable, and what began as a warning ended in tragedy. The room fell silent, her words settling over them like a quiet benediction. Dr. Haywood felt a profound respect for her, not just for her intellect, but for her understanding of the frailties that drove people to such acts. He glanced at the clock, 5:45 p.m., and noted the time, a habit now ingrained by the case's emphasis on precision. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting bag. I shall return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow, she said. The vicar's wife will be expecting me, and I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Lady Beatrice, Julian, who had returned to the room, shook his head. You've saved us, Miss Marple, in a way. The truth is painful, but it's better than lies. Miss Marple's smile was kind. Truth is always better, Mr. Ashford, though it comes at a cost. Take care of your mother, she will need you now. With that, she glided from the room, her small figure disappearing into the hall. Dr. Haywood followed her to the door, his voice low. Miss Marple, will you ever tire of solving these puzzles? She paused, her eyes twinkling. My dear doctor, as long as there are people, there will be puzzles. And I am but an old woman who likes to untangle them. As she stepped into the evening, Dr. Haywood watched her go, the phantom bells echo fading in his mind. The mystery was solved, but its lessons of love, loyalty, and the cost of secrets would linger in St. Mary's Bell long after Miss Marple's departure. Chapter 12. The aftermath. Morning of August 14, 1935. Dawned with a soft mist over St. Mary's Bell, cloaking the village in a quiet that felt both restorative and mournful. Bell Manor, once a beacon of elegance, now seemed subdued, its grand rooms echoing with the weight of the previous day's revelations. Dr. Arthur Haywood, standing at his bedroom window overlooking the meadow, reflected on the extraordinary events that had unfolded: the murder of Reginald Poole, the unmasking of Lady Beatrice's secret, and Mr. Grimes's confession, all unraveled by the unassuming Miss Jane Marple. The clock on his bedside table read 8 a.m., and he noted the time, a habit now ingrained by the precision demanded by the case downstairs. The breakfast room was sparsely attended. Lady Beatrice had not emerged from her quarters, and Julian Ashford was with her, offering what comfort he could as her newly acknowledged son. Clara Wentworth sat alone at the table, her face pale but composed, stirring her tea absently. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, for once subdued, was absent, reportedly indisposed after the emotional turmoil of the previous evening. Captain Lionel Drake was out walking the grounds, and Miss Lydia Prescott, her nerves frayed, had taken to her room. Only young Tommy Ashford was present, munching toast with a return of his usual energy, though his eyes still held a flicker of awe at the drama he had witnessed. Dr. Haywood joined Clara and Tommy at the table, his physician's instincts attuned to Clara's quiet demeanor. "Miss Wentworth," he said gently, "you seem thoughtful this morning. I hope you're managing under the circumstances." Clara offered a faint smile, her voice soft. "It's all so strange, Dr. Haywood. To think Mr. Poole's death was tied to such a deeply buried secret. I feel sorry for Lady Beatrice and for Mr. Grimes. He was loyal to a fault." Tommy, his mouth full of toast, piped up. "Miss Marple was brilliant, wasn't she? Like a detective in a book." "How'd she know it was Lady Beatrice's shawl?" Dr. Haywood chuckled, though his mind was still on the case. "Miss Marple has a way of seeing what others miss, Tommy. The shawl, the note, the bell, she connected them all through observation and understanding of human nature." As if summoned by her name, Miss Marple entered the room, her small figure neat in a tweed skirt and wear-upon cardigan, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Good morning, Dr. Miss Wentworth." "Tommy," she said, her voice warm. "I trust you've all managed some rest after yesterday's ordeal." Clara nodded, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't uncovered the truth, I might have been suspected. With all of Mr. Poole's questions about my past." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her needles emerging from her bag with practiced ease. "My dear, suspicion often falls on those who seem vulnerable, but truth has a way of clearing the innocent. Your past, whatever Mr. Poole thought he knew, was not the heart of this matter. It was Lady Beatrice's fear of losing her son's place in the world that drove this tragedy." Dr. Haywood leaned forward, intrigued. "Miss Marple, you mentioned last night that small errors betray us. The note in Poole's right hand, the will, those were the keys, weren't they?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as her needles clicked. "Indeed, Doctor. The note was the first thread to pull. A left-handed man would not clutch a note in his right hand. Not naturally. It suggested someone placed it there, someone unaware of his habit. And the will, such a small thing, but so telling. Lady Beatrice's shawl was missing, and the blue thread in the tower matched it perfectly. The bell, of course, was the signal. A call to action that went terribly wrong." Tommy's eyes widened. "But why did Grimes hit him? Couldn't he just scare him off?" Miss Marple's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "Loyalty, Tommy, can be a powerful force. Mr. Grimes saw his mistress threatened, her honor at stake. He acted in a moment of desperation, thinking a warning would suffice. But fear and anger are poor companions, and a single blow ended a life." Clara set down her teacup, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's so sad. Lady Beatrice only wanted to protect Julian, and now everything's changed." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze kind but unflinching. "Secrets, Miss Wentworth, are like shadows. They grow longer when left in the dark. Lady Beatrice's secret shaped her life, and Mr. Poole's greed exploited it. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I've seen such shadows before. They rarely end well, but they teach us to value the light of truth. Dr. Haywood, moved by her words, glanced at the clock 8:30 a.m. and felt a pang of regret that Miss Marple would soon depart. Will you stay for the engagement party, Miss Marple? It's to be tomorrow, though I suspect it will be a quieter affair now. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. No, Doctor, I must return to St. Mary Mead. My friend Mrs. Bantry will be expecting me, and I have a garden to tend. But I wish Mr. Ashford and Miss Wentworth every happiness. They have a chance to build something honest, now that the shadows are gone. As she spoke, Captain Drake entered, his face weathered but less guarded than before. Miss Marple, he said gruffly, I owe you an apology. I thought your questions were meddling, but you saw what I couldn't. I'm grateful. Miss Marple's Needles paused, and she looked up at him. No need for apologies, Captain. We all see through our own lenses. Mine are simply sharpened by years of watching village life. The conversation turned to lighter matters, but Dr. Haywood's thoughts lingered on the case. The phantom bell, the note, the will all had been clues to a deeper truth about loyalty and fear. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple rose, her bag in hand, and Dr. Haywood accompanied her to the hall, where a car waited to take her to the station. Miss Marple, he said, you've left St. Mary's Bell a wiser place. I hope we'll meet again. Her eyes twinkled as she adjusted her hat. Perhaps, Doctor. Life has a way of bringing puzzles to those who notice them. Until then, keep watching the little things, they tell the greatest stories. As her car drove away, Dr. Haywood stood on the steps of Bell Manor, the mist lifting over the village. The bell of St. Mary's remained silent, its phantom toll, a memory, but its lesson would linger in the hearts of those who had heard it. Chapter 13. The Village Whispers. The afternoon of August 14, 1935. The mist that had cloaked St. Mary's Bell had burned away, leaving the village bathed in a warm, golden light that belied the shadow of recent events. Bell Manor, though still grand, felt quieter, its halls marked by the absence of Mr. Grimes and the weight of Lady Beatrice's confession. Dr. Arthur Haywood, walking through the village toward his practice at 2 p.m., noted the time on his pocket watch, a habit now etched into his routine by the precision of the murder case. The streets buzzed with hushed conversations, the villagers exchanging theories about the phantom bell and the tragedy that had unfolded in their churchyard. Dr. Haywood's mind was still occupied by Miss Jane Marple's departure that morning. Her quiet wisdom had unraveled the mystery of Reginald Poole's death, exposing Lady Beatrice's secret and Mr. Grimes's fatal act of loyalty. Yet, as he passed the church, its silent bell tower looming over the meadow, he felt there were still ripples from the case that had not fully settled. The village, like any small community, thrived on gossip, and the truth about Lady Beatrice's past was already weaving itself into the fabric of St. Mary's. Bell. At the village shop, Dr. Haywood paused to collect his newspaper, where Mrs. Gibbs, the sexton's wife, was holding court behind the counter. It's a scandal, Doctor, she said, her eyes wide with excitement. Lady Beatrice, with a secret son, and poor Mr. Grimes, driven to murder for her sake. Who'd have thought it? In our quiet village, Dr. Haywood nodded, his tone measured. It's a sad business, Mrs. Gibbs. But Miss Marple saw the truth where we saw only shadows. Mrs. Gibbs leaned forward, lowering her voice. That Miss Marple, she's a marvel. My husband says she asked him about the bell, every detail, down to the lock on the tower door. Said it reminded her of a case in her village. Something about a stolen chalice. She's got a mind like a trap. That one. Dr. Haywood smiled faintly, recalling Miss Marple's knack for drawing parallels to her St. Mary Mead. she does indeed. Did Mr. Gibbs mention anything else about the tower? Anything unusual? Mrs. Gibbs frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. Only that the lock was scratched, like someone had tampered with it. He didn't notice till after the police came. Thinks it was forced before the bell rang. This new detail piqued Dr. Haywood's curiosity. A scratched lock suggested premeditation, reinforcing Miss Marple's theory that the bell's toll was a deliberate signal. He thanked Mrs. Gibbs and continued his walk, his thoughts turning to the Manor's remaining guests, Julian and Clara's. Engagement party was set for tomorrow, but the shadow of the murder hung over it, and Dr. Haywood wondered how the village would receive them now. Back at Bell Manor, he found Clara Wentworth in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath a rose arbor. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clearer than they had been, as if the truth had lifted a burden. "Dr. Haywood," she greeted, her voice soft but steady. "I was just thinking about Miss Marple. She saved me, from suspicion, from fear." Dr. Haywood took a seat beside her, noting the time to 30 p.m. "She has a remarkable gift," he said. "But you seem troubled, Miss Wentworth. Is there something more?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her shawl. "It's Julian. He's devoted to Lady Beatrice's mother, But the village is talking, and I'm afraid it will change how they see him. He's not the heir they thought. Not in the same way." Dr. Haywood nodded, understanding her concern. "The village will gossip, but time softens such things. Julian is still an Ashford, and you'll stand by him. That's what matters." Clara's smile was tentative, but grateful. "You're kind, Doctor. I only wish I'd told Miss Marple about Mr. Poole's questions sooner. He was so cruel, hinting at things about my father. I think he was trying to unsettle me, to see if I'd break." Dr. Haywood's interest sharpened. "What exactly did he say about your father?" Clara's eyes dropped to her lap. "He said he'd found records. Something about a debt my father owed years ago, before he died. He implied it was shameful, that it could ruin my marriage to Julian. But I don't know the details. Father never spoke of it." Dr. Haywood made a mental note, wondering if Poole's probing into Clara's past was another thread in his web of blackmail. Before he could press further, Captain Lionel Drake approached, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Doctor," Drake said, his voice gruff but less guarded than before. "I've been thinking about what Miss Marple said about small errors betraying us. I should have noticed the mud, the rope. I was too caught up in Poole's bluster to see what was in front of me." Dr. Haywood nodded, sensing the captain's need to unburden himself. "We all miss things, Captain. Miss Marple has a way of seeing the world differently, through the lens of human nature." Drake's jaw tightened. She does, makes me wonder what else I've missed in this village. I've known Beatrice for years, never would have guessed her secret." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Tommy Ashford, bounding down the path with a rolled-up newspaper. "Dr. Haywood, they're writing about the murder in the county paper. Says Miss Marple's a village sleuth who outsmarted the police." Dr. Haywood chuckled, taking the paper. The headline read, "Phantom Bell Mystery Solved by Spinster Detective," and he could almost see Miss Marple's amused smile at the description. "She'd likely say she's just an old woman who notices things," he said as the afternoon wore on. Dr. Haywood returned to his practice, but the village's whispers followed him. The scratched lock, Clara's father, the lingering questions about Poole's motives, all were echoes of the case, reminders that even a solved mystery left ripples. He glanced at the church tower, its bell silent but its presence enduring, and felt a quiet gratitude for Miss Marple's clarity. St. Mary's bell would heal, but its story, like the bell's toll, would resonate for years to come. Chapter 14. The engagement's shuttled evening of August 14, 1935, brought a tentative calm to Bell Manor as preparations for Julian Ashford and Clara Wentworth's engagement party proceeded, though the event was now a subdued affair. The grand dining room, adorned with white roses and flickering candles, held a smaller gathering than originally planned, with only the closest family and a few village notables invited. Dr. Arthur Heywood, invited as both friend and physician, arrived at 7 p.m., noting the time on his pocket watch with his customary precision. The air was heavy with the aftermath of Reginald Poole's murder and the revelations about Lady Beatrice's secret. Yet there was a quiet determination to celebrate love amid the sorrow. Dr. Heywood stood near the French doors overlooking the terrace, observing the guests. Lady Beatrice, pale but regal in a black silk gown, presided with a strained smile, her eyes often resting on Julian, who stood beside Clara, his hand protectively on her arm. Clara, in a soft ivory dress, was radiant but subdued, her gaze occasionally drifting to the meadow where the church tower loomed. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, recovered from her indisposition, chatted animatedly with the vicar's wife, though her usual gossip lacked its former zest. Captain Lionel Drake stood alone by the fireplace, nursing a glass of brandy, while Miss Lydia Prescott, her nerves steadier, moved quietly among the guests, assisting with the arrangements. Young Tommy Ashford, dressed in a slightly ill-fitting suit, darted about, his energy undimmed by the recent tragedy. The absence of Miss Jane Marple was keenly felt, her departure to St. Mary Mead leaving a void in the manor's atmosphere. Dr. Heywood, reflecting on her role in solving the mystery, felt a pang of regret that she could not witness this moment of fragile renewal. The phantom bell, the scrawled note, the blue wool all had been unraveled by her keen insight. Yet the village's whispers, as he had heard from Mrs. Gibbs, suggested that not all questions had been answered. As the guests gathered for the toast, Julian raised a glass, his voice steady but emotional. To Clara, my love, and to all of you who stood by us through this dark time. We've lost much, but we've gained truth, and that's a foundation to build on. Clara's eyes shimmered with tears as she smiled at him, and the room murmured its approval. But Dr. Heywood, ever observant, noted a flicker of unease in Clara's expression, as if something still weighed on her. He recalled her words about Poole's probing into her father's past debt, a shameful secret, and wondered if it lingered like an unresolved chord. Captain Drake approached Dr. Heywood, his voice low. Doctor, this party feels like a brave front, but the village won't let this go. They're still talking about Beatrice's secret, and some say Poole had more enemies than we know. Dr. Heywood nodded, his thoughts returning to Mrs. Gibbs's mention of the scratched lock on the tower door. You're right, Captain. Poole's blackmail touched many lives. I wonder if Clara's fear of his questions points to something deeper. Drake's eyes narrowed. You think there's more to her story. She's a quiet one, but there's steel beneath that softness. Before Dr. Heywood could respond, Miss Prescott approached, her face pale but composed. Dr. Heywood, I wanted to thank you for your kindness. And Miss Marple, she saw what I couldn't. I was so afraid Poole's accusations would ruin me. But now I feel lighter. Dr. Heywood smiled gently. Miss Marple has a gift for freeing people from their shadows, Miss Prescott. You've nothing to fear now. As the evening progressed, the band struck up a waltz, and Julian led Clara to the floor, their movements graceful but tinged with solemnity. Dr. Heywood watched them, his mind churning over the case's lingering threads, the scratched lock, Clara's untold secret, the village's whispers. He glanced at the clock, 8:30 p.m., and made a mental note to speak with Clara privately, sensing that her story might hold the final piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Carver, sidling up to him, lowered her voice. Doctor, isn't it odd that Clara's so quiet tonight? After all, she's free of Poole's threats. Or is she? Dr. Haywood's brow furrowed, her words echoing his own thoughts. Perhaps she's simply overwhelmed, Mrs. Carver. But I'll speak with her, Miss Marple would say. The smallest hesitations often hide the greatest truths. As the waltz ended, Clara excused herself and stepped onto the terrace, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulders. Dr. Haywood followed, sensing an opportunity. Miss Wentworth, he said gently, joining her in the cool evening air, you seem troubled. Is there something you haven't shared about Poole? Perhaps. Clara's eyes met his, wide with a mix of fear and resolve. Dr. Haywood, you've been kind, like Miss Marple. There is something. But I'm afraid. Poole said my father owed a debt to the Ashford estate years ago, before I was born. He hinted it was tied to Lady Beatrice's secret, but I don't know how. I didn't tell Julian I couldn't bear to burden him. Dr. Haywood's heart quickened. A debt to the estate. Did Poole say anything more? Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. Only that it could ruin us. I thought it was a lie, but now I'm not sure. Dr. Haywood placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Clara, the truth has a way of healing, as Miss Marple showed us. Speak to Julian and to Lady Beatrice. Whatever this debt is, it's better faced together. Clara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. You're right. I'll tell them tonight. As they returned to the dining room, Dr. Haywood felt a quiet satisfaction. The Phantom Bells mystery had been solved, but its echoes had stirred truths that would shape the future of Bell Manor. The engagement party, though shadowed, marked a new beginning, and he sensed that Clara's courage would light the way forward. Chapter 15. The final thread. Morning of August 15, 1935, broke with a gentle clarity over St. Mary's Bell, the village stirring under a sky of pale blue. Bell Manor, though marked by the recent tragedy, seemed to breathe easier, as if the truth uncovered by Miss Jane Marple had lifted a long-held burden. Dr. Arthur Haywood, walking the Manor's gravel drive at 9 a.m., noted the time on his pocket watch, a reflex honed by the precision of the murder case. The engagement party the previous evening had been a quiet triumph, a step toward healing for Julian Ashford and Clara Wentworth. Yet Clara's revelation about her father's debt to the Ashford estate lingered in Dr. Haywood's mind, a final thread in the tapestry of the Phantom Bell mystery. In the Manor's morning room, Dr. Haywood found Clara, Julian, and Lady Beatrice seated around a small table, their faces a mix of resolve and vulnerability. The room, with its soft light and scent of fresh lilies, felt like a sanctuary after the storm. Clara's hands were steady as she spoke, her voice clear but soft. Dr. Haywood, I told them everything last night about Mr. Poole's hints, the debt my father owed. I was afraid it would change things, but it hasn't. Lady Beatrice, her silver hair impeccable despite the strain in her eyes, nodded. Clara was right to speak. The debt was a matter from 20 years ago, a loan my late brother made to Clara's father, Mr. Wentworth, for a failed business venture. It was never repaid, but it was forgotten, or so I thought. Mr. Poole must have found the records in the estate's archives. Julian, his arm around Clara, looked at Dr. Haywood with gratitude. Aunt Mother forgave the debt long ago. Poole was using it to frighten Clara, to drive a wedge between us. But we're stronger for it now. Dr. Haywood smiled, his physician's heart warmed by their unity. Miss Marple would be pleased. I think she always said truth clears the way for light. As if on cue, a letter arrived from St. Mary Mead, delivered by the Morning Post. Lady Beatrice opened it, her hands trembling slightly, and read aloud. My dear Lady Beatrice, I trust this finds you and your household finding peace after the sad events at Bell Manor. The human heart is a complex thing, but it is never stronger than when it faces truth. I wish Mr. Ashford and Miss Wentworth every happiness, and I hope St. Mary's Bell will know only quiet bells in the future. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. Haywood felt a surge of admiration for the absent sleuth, whose simple words carried such weight. He glanced at the clock. 9:30 a.m. and made a mental note to preserve the letter, a testament to Miss Marple's insight. Captain Lionel Drake entered, his face less guarded than in days past. "Doctor, I've just come from the village. The talk's dying down, thanks to you and Miss Marple. They're calling her the spinster Sherlock now." Dr. Haywood chuckled. "She'd laugh at that, I'm sure. But she saw what we couldn't: the bell as a signal, the note as a deception, the wool as a betrayal of haste." Clara's eyes softened. "I wish I could thank her. She made me see I don't need to fear my father's past. It's part of me, but it doesn't define me." Lady Beatrice reached for Clara's hand, her voice steady but warm. "Your family now, Clara. The past is settled, and the future is yours and Julian's." As the morning unfolded, Dr. Haywood stepped onto the terrace, the church tower visible across the meadow. The bell remained silent, its phantom toll a memory now, but its lesson endured. He thought of Miss Marple's words about the little things: mud, wool, a note in the wrong hand, and how they had unraveled a crime born of fear and loyalty. The village of St. Mary's Bell would carry the scars of this mystery, but it would heal. Its people bound by the truths they had faced together, returning to his practice. Dr. Haywood paused at the churchyard, where Mr. Gibbs was tending the hedge. "Morning, doctor," the sexton called. "That Miss Marple, she's a wonder. Said my scratch lock was a clue, and she was right." Dr. Haywood nodded, his eyes on the tower. "She saw the pattern, Mr. Gibbs, and she taught us to see it too." As he walked on, the village settling into its familiar rhythm, Dr. Haywood felt a quiet certainty that the phantom bell's echo had faded, replaced by the promise of new beginnings. Miss Marple's work was done, but her legacy a reminder. To watch the small things would linger in St. Mary's Bell, a village forever changed by the truth.